Dan Blocker, the gentle giant Hollywood never truly understood. What if the man who symbolized innocence, strength, and kindness on television carried far deeper scars than anyone ever imagined? And what if, decades later, his own son finally confirmed what many fans quietly suspected all along? For generations, Bonanza fans embraced Cartwright as the moral heartbeat of the Cartwright family, a towering figure with a childlike soul and an unshakable sense of right and wrong. But behind that beloved character stood Dan Blocker, a man whose real life was shaped by war, conviction, sacrifice, and a quiet defiance of fame itself. Now, years after his untimely death, revelations from his son shed new light on who Dan Blocker truly was, and why his legacy still resonates so deeply today. But to understand that truth, we must return to the very beginning. Born big, destined for more. Dan Blocker entered the world on December 10, 1928, in DeKalb, Texas, already making history. Weighing an astonishing 14 pounds, he was quite literally larger than life from his first breath. His parents, Ellen and Carl Blocker, later described him as more than a handful, but somehow impossible not to love. Growing up in the small West Texas town of O'Donnell, Dan learned humility early. The family ran a modest grocery store that doubled as a community hub. Behind the wooden counters and dusty shelves, young Dan learned the rhythms of responsibility, carrying sacks of flour for elderly neighbors, climbing ladders to stock shelves, and listening intently to the worries and stories of local farmers. These formative experiences taught him that strength came with service. By age 10, he was laboring alongside grown men on construction sites, and by 12, he already towered at 6 feet tall, weighing over 200 pounds. His physical presence alone could have intimidated anyone, but Dan never used it that way. Here's a question worth pondering. How does someone with overwhelming physical power grow into a man admired not for dominance, but for gentleness? Even when confronted by local bullies, Dan's response was never anger. Instead, he relied on patience, empathy, and sometimes humor. Strength, to him, was responsibility, not aggression, a principle that would define both his personal life and his professional career. From football fields to footlights, Dan's size made him a natural athlete. At the Texas Military Institute, he excelled on the football field and earned a scholarship to Sul Ross State University. At over 6 feet 4 inches and nearly 275 pounds, he looked destined for a professional sports career. Teammates described him as gentle off the field, unstoppable on it, a paradox that became a hallmark of his personality. But life, as often happens, intervened in unexpected ways. One day, the college drama department needed someone strong enough to move heavy stage props. Dan volunteered. That small act placed him on stage in a minor role in Arsenic and Old Lace. Something inside him stirred, an unfamiliar thrill at telling stories and embodying characters far different from himself. Have you ever stumbled into your life's calling by accident? Dan did. Within months, he switched his major to theater, turning down football opportunities and pursuing a riskier, less certain path. That choice eventually took him to New York City, to the heart of Broadway, where he performed in King Lear and refined the emotional depth that would later define his acting. Yet before Hollywood could claim him, history demanded another chapter. The war that changed him forever. After college, Dan Blocker enlisted in the U.S. Army during the Korean War. The enlistment process itself was a struggle. Finding boots to fit his size took weeks, but once deployed, his strength became invaluable. Serving as a combat infantry sergeant with the 179th Infantry Regiment, Dan confronted the brutality of war firsthand. By Christmas 1951, he was entrenched near Chorwon, North Korea. Nights were freezing, and the constant threat of enemy fire created an unrelenting tension. Then came Pork Chop Hill, a battle etched into military history for its ferocity. During the firefight, Dan witnessed a fellow soldier trapped under fire. Without hesitation, he charged forward, dragging the man to safety, and was wounded in the process. He received a Purple Heart, but the deeper wounds were invisible. War, for Dan, was not about glory. It was about witnessing the fragility of life and the cost of humanity's failures. After returning home, he became a vocal critic of wartime tactics, particularly the use of napalm. This conviction would quietly influence every role he played in Hollywood, infusing his performances with a sense of moral integrity. It raises a question still relevant today. How does one reconcile immense physical courage with a deep opposition to violence? Hollywood finds a reluctant star. After the war, Dan prioritized family life over fame. He married his college sweetheart, Dolphia Parker, and together they raised 4 children. At UCLA, he pursued a doctorate in theater, seeking knowledge rather than notoriety. Yet Hollywood noticed him. The 1950s and 60s were the golden age of television westerns, and Dan's towering presence, warmth, and authenticity made him a natural fit. Early roles in Gunsmoke, The Rifleman, and Have Gun, Will Travel were small, but he imbued each character with a humanizing quality rarely seen in the genre. Tough men, under his portrayal, were capable of tenderness, vulnerability, and ethical introspection. Then came Bonanza, and everything changed. Hoss Cartwright, more than a character. When Dan Blocker was cast as Hoss Cartwright, television history shifted. Hoss was the moral anchor of the Cartwright family, a man whose intelligence was measured not in academic terms, but in heart. Loyal, gentle, and unafraid to defend the weak, Hoss became a symbol of decency. Dan himself admitted that Hoss reflected his own ideals, particularly the lessons learned from childhood and war. Yet behind the screen, Dan remained a private man, cautious of fame's corrosive effects. He never sought celebrity. He sought authenticity. Have you ever met someone whose public persona barely scratches the surface of their true self? For Dan, Hoss was both a reflection and a shield, a way to live out ideals while protecting the complexities of his personal life. Family first, fame second. Despite his television success, Dan's family remained his priority. He raised his children with the same values he had absorbed in O'Donnell: kindness, integrity, and service. Friends recall how he would take family camping trips into the Texas hills, teaching survival skills, patience, and storytelling, the latter a passion he passed along. In Hollywood, few stars maintained such grounded lives. Dan's insistence on normalcy endeared him to colleagues, many of whom described him as the quiet conscience of the studio lot. Even during the height of Bonanza's popularity, he remained approachable, attentive to scripts, and deeply involved in production decisions that reflected his moral standards. The man behind the screen. Hoss Cartwright may have been the gentle giant viewers loved, but Dan Blocker's personal life revealed layers of depth rarely captured on screen. Friends and family describe him as a man of paradox, a towering figure with a childlike laugh, a fierce protector with a tender soul, a war hero with a profound distaste for violence. He was also known for small acts of heroism outside the spotlight, intervening in dangerous situations to protect strangers, mentoring young actors, and advocating for humane treatment of animals and children. These choices reinforced the moral framework he brought to Hoss, demonstrating that his life and art were inseparable. The untimely loss and lasting legacy. Tragically, Dan Blocker passed away unexpectedly on May 13, 1972, at the age of 43. Fans mourned not just the loss of Hoss, but the man who embodied principles they yearned for in themselves. The world lost a figure of immense physical presence and even greater emotional resonance. Years later, his son would confirm what many fans suspected, that Dan's on-screen kindness was not an act, it was a lived reality, forged through hardship, moral conviction, and love for family. It begs reflection. How often do we fail to see the struggles behind someone's public persona? How many gentle giants walk among us, unseen? Why Dan Blocker still matters. Decades after his death, Dan Blocker remains a symbol of integrity in entertainment. In a culture often obsessed with celebrity, his life reminds us that strength is measured not by power, but by empathy, not by fame, but by the consistency of one's principles. Hoss Cartwright lives on in reruns, but the real legacy belongs to the man who carried his values into every corner of his life. Dan Blocker showed that it's possible to be larger than life without sacrificing decency, that courage can be quiet, and that true strength lies in protecting what is vulnerable. And perhaps the most important question of all, in a world hungry for spectacle, how many of us can emulate the courage, humility, and kindness that Dan Blocker embodied? Audiences sensed something genuine. When Hoss Cartwright ambled across the screen with that slow smile and the open-handed laugh, viewers didn't just see a character, they felt a presence. They laughed with him, worried with him, forgave with him. What many didn't realize was that Dan Blocker wasn't acting kindness, he was living it. He carried himself with the kind of physical steadiness that made people trust him. Tall, broad, with a face that seemed to have been carved to hold gentleness, Dan turned his bulk into a kind of safe harbor for the other characters on Bonanza. But the gentle giant on screen was built from a life whose hard edges were almost as important as its softness. Behind Haas's easy humor was a man shaped by books, by the discipline of service, by small-town values, and by a philosophical touch that did not care for showmanship. Dan was not a man of small ambitions in the intellectual sense. He earned a master's degree in theater, and he read with appetite. Yet his ambitions never slid into self-promotion. He was drawn instead to a principle closer to a creed, an 18th-century Quaker ideal he paraphrased in his own way, "Do all the good you can." That line lived in his everyday gestures. When Haas sat with a neighbor in trouble on screen, Dan remembered the loneliness he'd seen in real men and leaned in. Could that be why Haas felt more like family than fiction to so many viewers? There was a study in contrasts in Dan's life. He could play a quiet thinker and a brawler in the same breath. He could be the man who made a child laugh and the veteran who flinched at the flash of artillery in a movie's background. Those war memories were never absent. They threaded through the way he touched on themes of protection and vulnerability. Dan had gone to war, serving in Korea, and like many who returned, he carried the freight of that experience into his later life. It taught him how fragile a person could be, and from that knowledge he drew a resolve to shield the small from the powerful. On set, his generosity was quiet but total. He formed brotherhoods with Michael Landon and Lorne Greene. These were friendships hardened not by publicity but by long hours, shared jokes, and mutual respect. He was Michael Landon's best man, a role that felt less like celebrity theater and more like a neighbor holding someone's hand through life. Dan's humor had a gentle edge to it. He could deflate a tense moment with a deadpan aside, then follow it up with an unexpected tenderness that made co-stars and crew say, "That's Dan." How often do we meet people whose kindness feels like a vocation rather than an accessory? Back home in Texas, the dynamic was simple. Neighbors didn't see a star, they saw Dan. He was the man at the county fair who remembered everyone's name, the one who tipped his hat at the grocery store and asked after your mother. Fame altered the logistics of his life, but not the quality. Family outings became public spectacles. Crowds who loved Haas did not easily distinguish between actor and character, but the core of his life remained quietly domestic. A wife, children, a kitchen table, and the ordinary business of being a husband and father. That domestic center is crucial to understanding a man who would later walk away from the heart of Hollywood. Unlike many in the spotlight, Dan didn't hunger for it. He tolerated applause because it was the shape his work took. He did not seek it as sustenance. The contradictions of fame, throngs on the street, cameras catching private birthdays, the loss of simple anonymity, ate at him. He had earned wealth from Bonanza. He had no scandals to hide. But at a certain point he began to ask a blunt, private question. What is success worth if my children grow up watching strangers follow them through parks? In 1970, Dan made a radical and singular choice. He moved his family to Switzerland. The decision startled fans who assumed success demanded permanence in the celebrity capitals of the world. Why leave Hollywood at the height of success? Not for money. Bonanza had made him secure. Not for scandal. There was none. He left for peace. In Switzerland, they found something scarce in the frenzy of L.A., quiet. Bonanza still aired across the globe, dubbed in German and other languages, but few recognized him in the lakeside villages where he walked with his family. His children could be children again. They wore ordinary clothes to school. Afternoons meant homework and bread from the corner shop, not autograph lines. What does it say about a man who chooses quiet over applause? Is it cowardice or courage? The move also hinted at a deeper restlessness. Dan disliked the noise of the times. He was a man of conscience who reacted strongly when he saw injustice. During a filming trip in the segregated South, when hotel management refused to accommodate black members of the Bonanza crew, Dan's answer was immediate and parliamentary in its simplicity. If they don't stay, none of us stay. The cast and crew left, and the incident passed into the kind of private history that circulates as legend among those who were there. He refused to perform for separated audiences and would not lend the show's glamour to a cause of exclusion. How many celebrities then, and now, would risk career discomfort for the dignity of a colleague? If you ask those who worked with him, they will tell stories that all point in the same direction. He was not grandstanding. He believed strength was a responsibility, not a license. "I hate a bully worse than anything," he once said. "If I see a big guy hurting a smaller one, I'll stop it." That ethic animated his best screen moments. Haas's moral clarity, his willingness to stand between raw power and raw need, was rarely showy and always necessary. In a business that often rewarded the clever fox, Dan was a slow, solid oak. Even his appetite became a kind of lore. The man who could cradle a child on his thigh could also put away a breakfast that would have fed a small platoon, a dozen eggs, loaves of bread, gallons of milk, Texan portions for a Texan heart. He loved the rustic, big flavors that reminded him of home, fried steaks, biscuits, pies that cut a slice of nostalgia. He co-owned the Ponderosa Steakhouse, a business choice that felt less like a cash grab and more like a sentimental bridge between the fiction that made him famous and the food that made him happy. But the physical demands of television, and the pressures to fit into costumes and camera frames, meant he dieted and exercised in cycles. The swings strained his health over time. What price do we place on the images we must produce for others? The end came suddenly and almost shockingly ordinary. In 1972, Dan underwent what should have been a routine operation to remove gallstones. At first, everything seemed fine. Then, in a cruel twist, a pulmonary embolism formed, an unseen traveler that lodged in his lungs, and Dan Blocker died on May 13, 1972, at the age of 43. The news moved across the world like an unexpected storm. Fans, colleagues, and neighbors were stunned. The everyday man they knew had been taken in a single baffling instant. The death was not the climax of a gradual decline, but a brutal punctuation that left unfinished sentences all across the life he had been building. After his death, myths gathered the way leaves gather in a gutter. One persistent rumor claimed he was buried in a piano box because of his size. The image feels like something from Tall Tale Country, grimly comic and impossible to forget, but it wasn't true. The legend, however false, spoke to how unforgettable he was. People wanted the story to match the man's outsized place in their imaginings. Why do we invent such fables about the dead? Is it our way of making the story fit the stature? Bonanza itself felt the absence the way a house feels the loss of a central beam. Hoss Cartwright wasn't just a character. He was, for many viewers, the show's moral and emotional core. After Dan's death, the cast and creators chose not to replace him. Michael Landon wrote and guided an episode that let absence speak louder than any new presence could. The camera lingered on a chair, a hat, a place at a table, small, honest visuals that said everything a dialogue could not. Fans noticed. Ratings dipped. The late seasons of Bonanza never quite recovered the easy, familial magic of the years when Hoss was there to anchor the narrative. A show that once felt like a family room slowly began to feel like a set of rooms missing one of their chairs. Could a program keep its soul after the person who embodied it was gone? The answer the audience gave, heartbreakingly, was no. In the years after, Dan's family kept the private parts of his life private in a way that matched his preferences in life. Dirk Blocker, one of his sons, would later reflect on growing up under the weight of a public image. Dirk confirmed what a lot of fans had suspected. His father had been pretty much the man the world saw on screen: kind, awkward in bright lights, thoughtful, impatient with cruelty, and quietly burdened by war. Dirk chose an acting career of his own that skirted the peaks of stardom, perhaps a tacit answer to a question his father had posed by example: is there another way to be in this business? The answer, for Dirk, was yes. He could build a craft life without the cost of a life lived under constant scrutiny. Dan's legacy, what he left behind beyond ratings and reruns, has the soft, stubborn quality of a family heirloom. It doesn't glint like a trophy, it warms like an old sweater. He was a soldier who came to abhor war's pointless violence. He was a gentle giant who used his strength to protect rather than dominate. He was a man who felt more comfortable in a kitchen than on a red carpet, and who chose, finally, to live where his children could grow outside the glare. In an industry and an era that often rewarded attention as an end in itself, Dan turned attention into a tool for small human acts. What would television, and life, look like if more creators cared about decency as much as drama? Even now, decades later, there are moments when viewers turn to reruns and feel a small, precise ache. Hoss Cartwright still sits at the dinner table, scratches his beard, stares at the horizon and says something oddly simple and profound. The character's sincerity is not an artifact of quaintness. It's a reminder that there are forms of strength that make room for tenderness. Dan Blocker's legacy persists because it answers a deep hunger in people, the desire to see power used kindly. Isn't that the kind of story we keep coming back to? In the end, Dan taught something quietly radical, that fame need not hollow you out, that strength can be an ethic, and that sometimes the bravest act is to walk toward small domestic peace rather than toward louder applause. His life asks us, still, simple questions we seldom answer. How will I be remembered? By how loudly I lived, or by how well I loved? What parts of my life are worth protecting from the show? And finally, when the cameras stop, how do we make the quiet matter? His is a legacy not measured only by the acres of footage or the size of his body in a photograph. It's measured in moments of refusal, refusals to let injustice pass, to let fame become a mask, to let the small go unprotected. In a world that often rewards cruelty and noise, Dan Blocker showed us something rarer, strength with compassion. And that, perhaps, is a legacy worth remembering.